debt, we're going to see more and more of our national expenditures go to paying interest on that debt, crowding out not only national security, but the safety net programs for the most vulnerable people in our country. Madam President, I would yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Michigan.
Thank you, Madam President. First, let me apologize for the hoarse voice as I have been recovering from a cold, but it's important for me to have the opportunity to speak on behalf of the people of Michigan and to speak about what is happening as everyone at home is scratching their head, trying to figure out why in the world, in the greatest country in the world, we have seen government services now shut down, and why there are those that think it's all right for us not to pay our bills and default the full faith and credit of the United States of America, and why folks aren't willing to just, in fact, open the government, pay our bills, and then negotiate. And in fact, we have been negotiating. We've negotiated on a lot of things. I'm proud to say we negotiated a successful bipartisan farm bill not that long ago. That's the real deficit reduction proposal that has actually passed the United States Senate with over 2/3 votes. So we certainly are willing to negotiate. Our leader, Senator Reid, was willing to negotiate and, in fact, did negotiate with the Speaker of the House. As we all know, the Speaker called him in September and indicated that he would like to see a 6-week extension of the current funding levels for the government while we were negotiating something more broadly on a budget. It was at a funding level that we don't believe is the right one in terms of investing in education, innovation, and creating jobs, but it was 6 weeks, and our leader said, after talking with all of us, that in the interest of negotiating and compromising, that we would be willing to do that. And so, as we know from Republican colleagues now in the House who said that was the intent, unfortunately, the Speaker could not follow through on what he had negotiated, the agreement he had negotiated, because of a minority in the House that's extremely intent and, in fact, has successfully achieved one of the goals they ran on, which is to shut the government down. But we have negotiated. We also have negotiated on the big picture. We know that a few years ago with the Bowles-Simpson Commission and with others that $4 trillion in deficit reduction over 10 years was picked as an important goal to be able to right-size and bring down our long-term debt. The good news is that not only have we cut the annual deficit in half, but of that $4 trillion, we've already agreed to $2.5 trillion of that in deficit reduction over the next 10 years. So over half of that has already been achieved. So when my friends on the other side of the aisle act as if nothing is happening, I first have to say the deficit has been cut in half, and secondly, that over half of our long-term goal on the debt has been achieved, and we need to keep going. Now, we don't need to shut the government down to do that. We don't need to default on our debts of the greatest country in the world to do that. We need to just work together to do that, which is why we would say that we just need to open the government, pay our bills, and continue to negotiate. Let's negotiate, but it is a continuation of negotiating. Because, in fact, weakening the full faith and credit of the United States of America, I mean, think about that. The greatest country in the world, the full faith and credit of the United States of America, that's been the highest standard in the world when you say the full faith and credit of the United States of America. And right now there are folks playing Russian roulette with that who are willing to weaken that and undermine our recovery, if not take us over another horrible economic cliff, and cost billions of dollars to American consumers. Now, given the seriousness of this and the fact that we're very, very close to having that happen, and the fact that we are the world's leader, 30 years ago, President Ronald Reagan warned about the consequences of the richest, most powerful nation in the world suddenly running out of money to pay its bills. And he said the full consequences of a default or even the serious prospect of a default, like people are flippantly discussing these days, by the United States of America are impossible to predict and awesome to contemplate. He went on to say, denigration of the full faith and credit of the United States of America would cause incalculable damage. This is President Ronald Reagan. President Reagan reminded Congress, never before in our history has the federal government failed to honor its financial obligations. To fail to do so now would be an outrage, his words. The Congress must understand this and bear full responsibility. We know that if the United States defaults on its obligations, if we don't pay our bills, the result will be a financial crisis worse than what we went through in 2008. And frankly, Madam President, I don't want any part of that. I know what happened in Michigan in 2008, 2009. I know our presiding officer, distinguished senator from Massachusetts, understands that as well, what happened to families and businesses all across America. To even come close to that is irresponsible. At that time, 57.5 million Americans, or excuse me, if that were to happen, 57.5 million Americans could very well lose their Social Security checks on time. My mom called me the other night, and 87 years old, doing great, and she said, I was at church on Sunday, and my friends were saying, that couldn't really happen, could it? I didn't know what to tell her. I said, no, Mom, it shouldn't happen. It's not happened before. But I can't promise, given the words of people who believe it's no big deal on the other side of the aisle, or of what's being said by the Speaker and by the Tea Party Republicans in the House, I couldn't absolutely say to her, don't worry about that. 3.4 million veterans might not get their disability benefits on time. We've just been debating whether or not we should make sure, as we must, that the VA is fully funded. And yet next week, if we don't back up the full faith and credit of the United States of America, veterans could very easily be in a situation of not getting disability checks, seniors, Social Security, Medicare. Children, families, communities, businesses, farmers. That's who will pay the cost of this default. Middle-class families will pay the cost of this. It will be catastrophic in terms of interest rate increases and loss of jobs if we do not stand together as Republicans and Democrats in the Congress of the United States and back up the full faith and credit of the United States of America. According to Goldman Sachs, if we adopt the China First model of only paying the interest on our debt, which has been proposed by the House, where we pay some of our debts but not others, the drag on our economy would be massive. They estimate we would lose 4.2% of our gross domestic product. And to put that in perspective, when the recession hit bottom in 2009, we lost 4.1% of GDP from the peak in 2007. And that was the worst recession in our lifetimes. This is not a game. This is serious. Even more concerning to me is that this would drive up borrowing costs for families, for small businesses, for our manufacturers that are back on their feet now and roaring and bringing back our economy. For every 1% increase in interest rates, we're told that Americans will pay $75 billion. $75 billion loss to the economy. When Republicans in the House took us to the brink of default 2 years ago, which resulted in the lowering of America's credit rating for the first time in history, even though we didn't default, just talk of default ended up lowering our credit rating for the first time in America's history. It cost the average family buying a home at the time about $100 every month for the life of their mortgage and higher interest rates. $100 a month for the life of the mortgage. That's outrageous and irresponsible. That same default crisis in 2011 cost taxpayers $19 billion in additional interest when our credit rating fell and interest rates went up. And where'd that $19 billion go? Right back on top of the national debt. And not only is it adding to the national debt, it threatens to erase America's retirement savings. In 2011, over $800 billion was lost in retirement accounts after the House Republicans played politics with the full faith and credit of the United States of America. If I might take just one more minute, I would ask unanimous consent.
Without objection.
This time, if we actually default, the fallout could be even worse, and the damage could be permanent. Madam President, this is the greatest, wealthiest, most powerful country in the world, and it's outrageous that this would even be considered. I would ask unanimous consent to put into the record a letter from the National Association of Manufacturers expressing their deep concern about the possibility of default. And I would just share finally.
Without objection.
The chairman of AT&T, it is unthinkable that the United States could default on its financial obligations, and it would be the height of irresponsibility for any public official to consider such a course. Our country deserves better. The people of this country deserve better. And we've got to do better for them. I would yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Madam President, I'm glad to join this debate, which throughout the afternoon has been peppered with the assertion that either Majority Leader Reid or the President or Democrats in general will not negotiate, that we will not negotiate. I remember when I was younger, there was a radio commentator, a man named Paul Harvey, and his little motto in his radio bits was to surprise you with the rest of the story. Well, on will not negotiate, you don't even have to get to the rest of the story. Go to the rest of the sentence. The rest of the sentence is that the President and the Majority Leader will not negotiate while the other side is holding hostages, while the Tea Party is holding hostages. Here is what our former colleague, my former ranking member on the Budget Committee, Senator Judd Gregg, has said about this. A small group of Republican legislators, led by the junior senator from Texas, decided to take as hostages government operations and the raising of the debt ceiling. Well, those are exactly the hostages. Federal employees who can't work, people and businesses who want or need federal services, those families we've heard so much about today who lost loved ones on the field of battle and can't get their death benefits. And there's an even bigger hostage out there, which is the threat of a catastrophic default, which would be the result of a failure to lift the debt limit. Our country's been through a lot, Madam President, through civil wars and world wars, through depressions and calamities of various kinds. Through all of that, we have never defaulted on our debt. But there is a group in Congress so desperate that they're willing to use that threat as a hostage for leverage in negotiations. So when colleagues on the other side invite us, in the old phrase, come let us reason together, let us negotiate, they don't mean come let us reason together, let us negotiate. They mean let us negotiate, but we want a blackjack in our pocket. If the negotiations don't go just the way we want to keep hundreds of thousands of Americans out of their jobs, and we want to threaten the economic security of this country. Madam President, there is a difference There is a difference that every American understands between negotiating and negotiating while threatening the hostages. And I will say that sanctimoniously offering to release a hostage here or a hostage there when a program becomes too popular or there's too much scrutiny on the damage that one thing is doing, you say, oh, well, we'll give that hostage up. We'll let us vote on that hostage, doesn't change the principle. There is a difference between negotiating in good faith, negotiating on the merits, and negotiating with threats to hostages. That is no road to go down. That is a very dangerous threat. As President Reagan warned us, Congress must realize that by failing to act, they're entering very dangerous territory if we don't raise the debt limit. Never before in our history has the federal government failed to honor its financial obligations. To fail to do so now would be an outrage. Ronald Reagan. The Congress must understand this and bear full responsibility. We have to address these problems in the traditional order of government with real negotiations. Because if we don't, if we yield to hostage-taking as the new way of governance in this country, where does it end? The continuing resolution that we proposed, that the Speaker has refused to have a vote on. In all this time, he's never had a vote on the continuing resolution that we passed that would open up the government. It would only extend the operations of government for 6 weeks. We'd be back at it again. What would the price be next time? After we defunded Obamacare, would they want to privatize Social Security? They tried that before. Over and over again, the popular will has to rule, and that we do through our American procedures. The vaunted procedures of our American system of government would be lost in a devil's game of threats and hostage-taking on both sides. Because two can play at this game if those are the new rules. We don't want to go there. America is a great country. And in part, we are a great country because our democracy is an example to the world. We are no example to anyone when we legislate by threats of default, disaster, and confusion, to use the felicitous phrase of our colleague from Alabama. There is a condition that sometimes befalls pilots called target fixation. It happens when a pilot diving on a target becomes so fixated on hitting that target that they become disoriented to their surroundings. And the worst thing that befalls somebody who's the victim of target fixation is that they crash the plane. Well, we right now have Republican target fixation on repeal Obamacare. Imagine passing it 40 times in the House, 40-some times, which they've done. If that's not a sign of target fixation, I don't know what is. Not seeing the damage that is being done by closing down the government, not seeing the damage to families, not seeing the damage to employees, not seeing the damages to people who depend on government services and licenses and safety checks, not seeing any of that, that seems to me to be a sign of target fixation. If they've got target fixation this badly, they may not actually see even President Ronald Reagan's warnings about how dire and dangerous it is to play around with our debt limit. They're already on the House side talking about playing around with our debt limit. They want to go into the danger zone, and who knows how close to the flame they're willing to fly. When they have target fixation, their judgment isn't very good. And they are certainly not seeing the damage to American values and American procedure that an insistence on legislating by holding hostages and threatening them does. It does damage to our values. It does damage to our procedures. a great observer of the American system of government, once described procedure as its bone structure. We can throw it all out. The Constitution, bicameralism, we can just go back to the basic animal state that whoever can make the worst threat wins the argument. That's not the American way. The American way isn't to win the argument by seeing how many people you can put at risk and how badly you can threaten them. But that is the stage that we are in right now. So let's negotiate indeed, but let's negotiate as Americans. Let's negotiate under our proper procedures. Let's open the government. There's no reason for it to be closed other than bargaining leverage, other than hostage-taking. There is no other reason. That's exactly why the Tea Party has shut down the government, just for that purpose. If you listen, they say it. They use nicer words. I think the word that was used earlier in debate today was to create adequate incentive. Well, yeah, when somebody else is holding hostages, we have incentive, but it's not appropriate incentive. So open the government and stop threatening the debt limit. That is wildly irresponsible. Don't believe us, believe Ronald Reagan. Believe the Secretary of the Treasury. Believe the National Association of Manufacturers. Believe the CEO of AT&T. Believe virtually every responsible, knowledgeable adult who has observed what the dangers are of blowing the debt limit and default. So open the government. Stop threatening the debt limit, and by all means, let's negotiate. We could set a date tomorrow. I'm sure the President will have a meeting at the White House the next day. Anything people wanted could be on the table, but they'd have to come in and negotiate like Americans, on the merits, and fairly, and not with a blackjack in their back pocket with threats that if they don't go and get what they want, they're going to go out and start wrecking things like our economy and our government. That's not the right way to proceed, and if we go down that road, who knows what evil lurks at the end. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Oklahoma.
I've listened very carefully to the previous speakers on the floor, and I understand a lot of their frustration. We are where we are. I think we have two big problems. Actually, we have two major problems. One is our country is bankrupt. People don't like to hear that, but let me give you what the facts are. The total unfunded liabilities of the United States of America is $126 trillion. If you had all the net worth of everybody in the country and all the assets of the federal government and all the assets of the state, and you combine them, we have $94 trillion worth of assets. We're already in the hole, $30 trillion. That doesn't include the $17 trillion in debt that we have. So I'd like to correct a couple of things. One, the senator from Michigan mentioned that we were downgraded because of the impasse in Congress. No, we got downgraded because Congress has failed to address the real problems of our debt and deficits. Go read their statement. Had nothing to do with action here. It had to do with the fact that we will not address the biggest problems in front of us. And I just for a minute like for us to consider it. I ask unanimous consent to have some scissors on the floor because I want to make a point in a minute.
Is there objection? Without objection.
We have a credit card. And I want you to think about your own personal life. That if in fact you have a limit on your credit card and your financial situation worsens, you're still paying the payments, but you're not bringing down the principal on your credit cards, and you're not earning any more money significantly, and you go ask Citibank or American Express or Chase and you say, I want you to raise my limit. You know the first thing you're going to ask you is, what have you done to improve your financial situation so that we might consider raising your credit limit? That's what happens to every other American. And we have this big talk about a debt limit. There's no debt limit in this country. We've increased it every time it's come up. There is no limit right now in this country on the debt that we have. So we hear all these speeches about the risk. You know what the real risk is? The risk is continuing to do nothing to address the underlying problems of our country. The risk is continue to add entitlement programs that have no way to pay for themselves and no reform of the entitlements that we have today. That's the risk. And how does that play out? We've heard all these dire warnings of what's going to happen. Well, here's what's going to happen to your children and grandchildren. What has happened over the last 15 years in this country. Do you realize the average median family income in real dollars now is at the same level it was in 1989? We're going backwards right now. Not addressing the real problems. And let me put it in medical terms since I'm a doctor. If, in fact, you treat symptoms of disease, raising the debt limit, rather than treating the real disease, which is reforming the problems, reforming our spending, quit having 100% involvement in everything Americans do from the federal government, if you continue to borrow the money and treat that as the symptom, when spending, the lack of oversight by Congress, the lack of real work by the members of this body to actually eliminate waste, which is over $250 billion a year, as outlined by the Government Accountability Office. And yet we ignore that for the political arena that we've seen the last couple of weeks in Washington. The real disease is not fixing the real problem. And of all the politicians, Republicans and Democrats alike, we want to give you a soft answer. Well, here's the answer. If you're $30 trillion in debt that you can't pay for, what you have to do is have everybody have some pain. And we refuse to do that. There's no leadership in Congress to address the real disease that we're facing. A government that's totally ignored the enumerated powers. A government that totally ignores the 10th Amendment. And now a Justice Department that really ignores the rule of law in terms of how they decide what they'll enforce and what they won't. Always on a political basis rather than on what the law says. Those are the real problems in front of us. And so when we hear all the dire warnings about, oh, you can't not raise the debt limit, well, what does default mean? Because they always say you can't raise the debt limit, but they won't talk about what default means. Default in the international financial community is you won't pay the interest and you won't pay back the principal on your bonds. That is never going to happen to us. It will require less than 6% of the cash we're taking in now to manage the debt we have right now. Less than 6%. So only somebody who wants to hurt us further would play the political game, if we ever got there, and I'm not saying we should get there, but if we got there, would only play the political game to not pay Social Security or not pay Medicare or not take care. We have more than enough money to do that. But what we have is a bloated, oversized, inefficient, ineffective federal government that nobody wants to hold accountable except the American people. So the question is who gets to decide? Congress obviously isn't deciding very well. The President hadn't shown any leadership on it. Maybe it's time for the American people to decide. Maybe it's time to take some of the power away from Washington and restore it where our founders thought it should reside, by respecting the enumerated powers, very specifically listed by our founders with very great commentary so that it wouldn't be distorted, but we've distorted it anyway, and re-embracing the 10th Amendment, which says everything that's not specifically enumerated in these powers is left to the power of the people and the states. So we find ourselves with a credit card. This happens to be our debt. The number I chose to put on here was our debt this morning. $16,747,458,528.90. We need to cut this up. Just like you do for an adolescent or young adult kid that you're responsible for the credit card. If they're not responsible, you cut up the credit card. You fix the real problem. You don't continue asking for an increase in their profligate spending. You don't continue to reward members of Congress who won't do oversight and get rid of $250 billion worth of fraud, waste, and abuse every year. But that's what we'll end up doing because we don't have the courage nor the leadership to address what is the real problem in front of our country. And the real problem is cowardice. The real problem is to not recognize where we are and not act on making decisive decisions. Now, we heard how bad it'll be if we don't raise the debt limit. I agree, it's going to be tough. There'll be ramifications. How bad will it be if we do? What happens to your children? What happens to the declining family income in this country if we do? If we continue to let the federal government run uncontrolled and out of control. If we continue to not hold Congress accountable for forcing efficiencies on the federal government. You know what can be done? There was an agreement called the Budget Control Act. And what it did is it forced sequester. Sequester is a stupid way to cut funding in the federal government, but it's far better than not cutting it at all. And what has sequester done? Sequester has forced agencies, because Congress won't force them, because we're afraid we might offend somebody, it has forced agencies to start making choices. Now, they're still making tons of bad choices, like the state, all the remaining money. They just spent $500,000. No, it was $5 million, pardon me. It was $5 million on new crystalware for all of our embassies. Do we have $5 million? What's wrong with the crystalware we have now? But they had to spend the money because we couldn't come back to Congress and say we saved $5 million. So we're addressing the wrong problems. We're not holding people accountable. And so consequently, maybe it's time for the states to exert and the people to exert some common sense on us. I dare say there's not one member of this body that would let their adolescent child run up a bill and then not eventually try to intercede on a credit card, but just let them continue to run it up. Well, Congress and the U.S. government is that adolescent child. We're the adolescents, and the people and the states are the grown-ups. And we're at where we are today, at an impasse, and it really does kind of sound like kindergarten. I'm not going to talk to you. I don't like the way you did that. You know, we had the majority leader the other day claim that the House was out of bounds because they got to pick and choose what we'd pay for. You know, it just so happens in the Constitution, that's what it says. The House of Representatives gets to pick and choose. All spending bills start in the House. They have to start in the House. They get to pick and choose. Now, we don't have to accept it, but they get to pick and choose. So just a lack of understanding on the basic concepts that our founders set up. You know, they know the history, and they knew the history of republics. Republics always die. There isn't one that has survived as long as we have. And they decline and die over the same thing. They get in trouble financially. We're in trouble financially. We're $30 trillion in the hole, plus another $17 trillion in debt. Wouldn't it be smart if we started addressing that problem before we blankly give an increase in the level of the credit card? Actually, what we should do is we should cut this credit card up, which is what I'm going to do, because that's the way I vote. I think it's time we quit borrowing money. Actually, I think I'll just tear it up. time we quit borrowing money against the future of our kids. It's time we quit mortgaging their future. It's time we start taking responsibility for the actions of the federal government rather than giving excuses on why we can't get together and address the real problems of this country. Congress fails to do the oversight. You know, we just had a hearing yesterday where we showed one of the problems inside the Social Security disability system. It was a bipartisan hearing, lots of work done. There are real problems. That trust fund, for those people who are truly disabled in this country, will run out of money within 18 to 24 months. Finance Committee hadn't offered any bill to fix it. House and Ways hadn't offered any, Ways and Means hadn't offered any programs to fix it, but yet it's going to be bankrupt. What does that mean for somebody who's truly disabled? It means their check's going to get cut. Now tell me whether you'd rather spend $5 million on new glassware for our embassies, crystal, or $5 million for somebody who's truly disabled. That's where the real decisions need to be made, but we won't make them. You know, if you talk about our national debt, when I came to the Senate in 2005, every American owed $24,000 on the national debt. It's now almost $53,000 in a little over 8.5 years. So 2.5 times what we used to owe, we now owe. How did we get there? Why did we do that? Why did we let that happen? Why don't we learn to live within our means? Is there always a political reason? Is there always a reason where you can game somebody to say they don't care if you don't want to do this? You certainly couldn't care about Americans if you don't want to spend money that we don't have on things that we don't need. If you look at the $120-some trillion, $125.8 trillion, that works out to $1.1 million per family. Now think about that. That's our unfunded liabilities, and that's going to come due over the next 50 years. And if you have children or grandchildren like I do, I really don't want their opportunities to be totally limited by this debt load that we're having. So we have all this politicking and posturing and political expediency going on in both bodies, and nobody's talking about what the real problem is. The real problem is we're spending a lot of money that we don't have, that we're borrowing from other countries on things we don't absolutely need. The second part of the problem is we have programs that are designed to benefit people that are riddled with waste and fraud. $100 billion in Medicaid and Medicare. Nobody really questions that number. It's been authenticated by 4 separate studies outside of the government. The inside of the government, we say it's 80. Why would we continue to let a system run that has that kind of fraud in it? We're getting ready to crank up the Affordable Care Act. We are cranking it up. And we've now said we're not going to authenticate somebody's reliability as to their income. What do you think the fraud on that's going to be? We know in the child tax credit what the fraud rate is. It's well over 20%. In the earned income tax credit, we know it's well over 20%. So 1 out of every $5 we pay out there is to people who don't deserve it. We're going to see the same thing in this. Why would we do that when we have this kind of problem in front of us? You know, in the last 2 years, our debt limit has increased twice what our economy has grown. And for every dollar of new debt we take in, we're getting about 2 to 3%, 2 or 3 cents of economic growth out of it, out of that new debt. Used to be, America, when they'd borrow $1, it'd get 35 or 40 cents of growth out of that debt. So we now have, in the last 2 years, we've increased the debt limit to $0.405 trillion, and the economy's grown less than $1.2 trillion in the last 2 years. We're adding $26,000 to our national debt every second. Every second. And there's no question, our economy's growing, some, far less than marginal. And why isn't it growing? It isn't growing because the American people don't have confidence in the future. How do we restore confidence in the future? We restore confidence by modeling a behavior that says we're going to act responsibly with their future, which means we're going to make the hard choices, even if it costs us our political career, to solve the problems in Washington so that the generations that follow us will not suffer a lower standard of living, but also so we can instill the confidence in the American economy. You know, it's $3 trillion in cash sitting in this country right now. Not federal government money, private money. $3 trillion. Why is it sitting there and why isn't it being invested? It's not being invested. That $3 trillion would create 700,000 or 800,000 new jobs a year. That $3 trillion. Why is it not being? Because they don't have the confidence in the future. I want to tell you a story about Virgil Juergensmeyer. Virgil grows mushrooms in a business and other vegetables. And this past August he told me that he was thinking about expanding his business, about a $5 million expansion to add a couple hundred jobs in a very small town in northeastern Oklahoma. And yet he was afraid to do that. He has plenty of business. He's buying $50,000 to $100,000 worth of product from his competitor every month because he can't produce it. He says, I don't think it's worth the risk right now given where our country is. I'm not sure. Well, that's happening all across this country. There's no confidence. So it brings me to the second point that I wanted to talk about. We're not just bankrupt as a nation. Our leadership is bankrupt. Leadership is about creating a vision and bringing people together, not creating controversy and dividing people. It's not about pointing out the worst flaws of somebody. It's about reinforcing the best flaws. It's about selling the confidence that we can do this together. And do you realize we can do this together as a nation? There isn't a problem in front of us that we can't solve if we choose to solve it. You remember the Debt Commission? I was a member of that committee. We voted on some big plans that would have solved a lot of the problems that we're facing this very week in this body. I didn't like every bit of it, but it was a chance to try to bring together both sides and solve it. Not once was it taken up on the floor by the majority leader. The president never embraced it. His own commission, his own fiscal commission, never embraced it. It was the greatest failure of leadership I've ever seen because you had bipartisan cover. You had conservatives and liberals agreeing that here's a plan that we can work out. And yet it was thrown away. And the only time with the politics that we see in Washington today that you're going to solve these big problems is when both political parties take the pain evenly. And nobody wants to do that. Everybody wants to gain. It's all short-term political expediency. In the words of my friend Erskine Bowles, where we are today is the most easily predictable problem you would have ever seen. All you got to do is look at the path of the numbers. It's true our deficits are down a little bit, but we raised $70 billion in taxes last year, and the economy's growing. It just shows what potential there is if we would put the economy on a steam where we had confidence. You know, we could add $500–600 billion a year in revenues to the federal government. But we won't do that. Today we find ourselves in worse condition than we did in 2011. And in 2011 we were told we can't do big things. You have to wait. So we had a debt limit increase. So tell me how we've gotten better since then. We have an unfunded liabilities are growing faster every year. Our true debt to GDP ratio is now over 100%, counting all debt, internal and external. We've not done it. Hundreds of thousands of federal workers right now are furloughed because Congress, not Republicans, Congress, has failed to do its job, has failed to compromise, has failed to reach a meaningful agreement that gives both groups something that they can claim that they actually worked on the real disease. Madam President, how much time have I consumed?
23 minutes.
All right, I'll finish. Would you let me know at about 28 minutes, please?
Without objection.
Let me describe also what's going to happen in about 20 years, maybe 10. If we don't address these problems, it won't matter what the debt rating agencies say. We will have developed a pattern that says we think we can continue to borrow and continue to raise the limit and not make the structural changes that puts us on a path to solvency. So what does that look like? What that looks like is borrowing costs going up. My friends all talk with, and the President said today maybe our borrowing costs will go up if in fact we don't raise the debt limit. Well, guess what? Our borrowing costs are going up every day that we don't address these problems, whether we raise the debt limit or not. Because eventually the rest of the world's going to say we don't think they're willing to cut up the credit card. They're not willing to make the sacrifices that are necessary to put our country on a path to prosperity. We have all the capabilities in the world to address our problems. We do not have the leadership that will get us there. And I'm not just directing that at the President. I'm directing that at my own party. So what's the solution? I'm going to spend the next couple of days outlining waste in the federal government, fraud in the federal government, duplication in the federal government. But the solution is called sacrificial leadership. It means modeling the behavior that says you're willing to give up something, maybe the prestige of being in office, to actually fix the long-term problems of our country. It's leadership that calls out the best of us instead of pointing out the worst in us. You don't see that very often here. You did when I first came. You certainly don't now, and that's a function of leadership in the Senate. Majority Leader Reid and I don't agree on much, that's obvious, but in a previous discussion on the Senate floor, Leader Reid said meaningful deficit reduction requires shared sacrifice. We're never going to get there unless everybody shares in it. The other point I would make is we're living off the next generation right now. We're going to borrow $2,000 against the future of every man, woman, and child in this country this year alone. They're going to have to pay it back. Or another way of putting it is 1 out of every 4 hours that you work, the federal government right now is confiscating of everybody in our economy. And it's soon going to be 2 out of every 4 hours you work. Now, our country was founded on the idea of liberty and freedom. When the confiscatory rates that will have to be there to pay back our debt or to at least borrow more money come, half of your work is going to be for the federal government, not your state or local. It's going to be to pay the bills of the federal government. And so money that's going to go to interest is money that isn't going to be invested. It's money that isn't going to improve education, isn't going to invent the next new technology. So I believe we can solve our problems, but I think it requires an informed public. Do you realize the federal government is twice the size it was in 1999? Right? It's twice. It's 2 times as big as it was in 1999. Think about that for a minute. If you extrapolate, that means in another 12 years, 13 years, it's going to be 4 times as big as it was in 1999. And the question comes is, are you getting value Is it efficient? Is it productive? Is it what we want to do? I think we can cheat history as a republic. As a constitutional republic, I think we can cheat history. I don't think we have to go down the path that every other republic has gone down. But it's going to require real leadership and shared sacrifice on everybody in this country part. It's going to require we take the spending out of the tax code for the well-heeled that have placed special benefits in the tax code for themselves. It's going to require that we reform Medicare.
Senator has consumed 28 minutes.
Thank you. That we reform Medicare. That we fix Medicaid. That we control how the federal government buys and uses things. It's going to require us to eliminate multitudes of duplicative programs that have no real benefit other than to benefit the politicians. It's going to require shared sacrifice. So we can go down that path, unite our country, bring us together with a vision that through this together we can all accomplish what is needed for our children and grandchildren. Or we can continue this petty little kindergarten game that's going on in Washington right now that everybody knows get bent out of shape, saying they're right or they're right, and playing off the merit. None of us in Washington are right. The founders were right. The enumerated powers were right. The 10th Amendment was right. We're dead wrong. It's time we grow up and start understanding the vision of our founders that secures our liberty and preserves our future. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Colorado.
Thank you, Madam President. Before he leaves the floor, I just want to thank the Senator from Oklahoma for his commitment to this issue, for his candor. We don't necessarily agree on every single thing, but I do know he's a man of great conviction, and we're lucky to have him in the Senate. And it's my hope that we can get to a place where we actually are together addressing these budget issues in a way that's not a management by crisis or one across-the-board cut after another, but actually is a thoughtful plan to relieve our children and our grandchildren of this burden that we're threatening them with. So, through the chair, I thank my colleague. I came to the floor today after the Senator from Oklahoma described today as a day of petty kindergarten political games to talk about a place where they're not playing any of those right now, and that's a town in Colorado that I represent called Estes Park, which has been a beacon of resilience. It's in the mountains just northwest of Boulder. It's the gateway to Rocky Mountain National Park. I can see from the President's reaction that you may have been there. The town of several thousand residents hosts 3 million visitors a year, including an average of over 500,000 visitors in the month of September. This time of year is peak tourist season. The weather is beautiful. The aspen's leaves are even more beautiful than the weather, and the elk famously wander through the park and through the town. Whether you're coming to rest or recreate, Estes Park welcomes you, and it always has. In 2011, visitors generated $196 million in tourism spending and supported more than 2,700 jobs. By some estimates, tourism accounts for 43% of local employment. When the floods hit in Colorado, Madam President, Estes Park was almost entirely cut off from the outside world. Here's Route 34 going to Estes Park. Two of the major roads into town were wiped out for miles at a stretch, leaving only one road into town. Many homes and businesses were destroyed, but the residents of Estes Park picked themselves up and began the recovery process, and limited access to the town has been restored. Folks have just started opening up their businesses again. Visitors had just started returning to Rocky Mountain National Park again, and then Congress stepped in and dealt an unbelievably cruel blow by shutting down this government. Let me quote what Estes Park resident Tom Johnson said on the Tuesday of the shutdown. Quote, "I think politicians are playing around like they do. And it's the people who wind up with all the problems for it. Man, they did it to Estes Park when they shut down that park. The Rocky Mountain National Park closed with the shutdown. Hundreds of campers have had to cancel their reservations, and likely thousands more canceled their plans to visit. The Denver Post reported that if visitors to Estes Park declined by 70%, it could mean the loss of 1,100 jobs, $90 million in spending, $5.8 million in sales tax revenue, and $4.4 million in local taxes. This is one community in Colorado, one community in the United States of America tonight as we horse around here in the United States Congress. The shutdown is a kick in the teeth to our local governments and small businesses and their efforts to recover from these floods. One of the area's more famous businesses is the Stanley Hotel. John Cullen, the hotel's owner, told us that while it's booking visitors for long weekend trips, it's been slow to bring in the usual number of guests during the week. He says it's because locals can't come to Rocky Mountain National Park for the fall foliage. He tells us they've done everything they can to keep the hotel open because it's a major employer in Estes Park, but he's losing money on a daily basis. Diane Muno is a local business owner in Estes Park with 4 retail shops. The Spruce House and the Christmas Shop and our 2 local Christmas holiday stores, the White Orchid and the White Orchid Bridal Shop, sell clothing and other apparel. Some of these businesses have been serving customers in Estes Park since 1969, Madam President. They are institutions in this Colorado community. The flooding damaged 3 of 4 of her businesses. 1 was seriously damaged and not yet reopened. The other 2 rushed to reopen, to recover, and they would have been fine, except we closed Rocky Mountain National Park, and that has slowed foot traffic in a significant way. Diane's October revenue for these 4 stores is down 67%, 2/3 down from this point in October last year. She typically has 12 to 15 employees, but she's working a skeleton crew of 6. Another business damaged by the floods was Kind Coffee. Its owner, Amy Hamrick, has been relying on internet sales while she's working to reopen the store. The community has rallied around this store, as our communities that have been struck by the flood have done. It's bought coffee beans and mugs and T-shirts online, helped clean up floodwaters. But the same story holds. She took a huge hit when the government shut down, making horrible things worse. Amy's husband, David Hamrick, a firefighter with the U.S. Forest Service, has been furloughed. This is what this inability of Washington's politicians to get done the most basic function that we have to keep the government running has wrought in this one Colorado community. Amy told National Public Radio, "We carry on through the middle of October with tourism dollars and locals coming to see the elk rut and to go into the park and see the color. And the National Park is our largest employer in town, so our community has now lost a lot of jobs in the interim." This is exactly why it's the wrong moment for Colorado, for Estes Park to have Washington's dysfunction come crashing down. They don't deserve it. They don't deserve it. But as they're now saying in Estes Park, they're mountain strong, and they'll get through it. And I know that they will. Amy Hamrick took the time to remind us that 90% of the town is open, dry, and ready for customers. She said the town is beautiful, and golf courses have elk on them 24 hours a day. Estes Park, like much of Colorado, has taken a hit, but it won't stay down. The community continues to pull together and recover. As expected, its neighbors are going to go the extra mile to help everybody out. This quote from Jeannie Beyer captures the spirit of Colorado. She said, "We live down in Loveland. It's difficult for people down there right now. I know it's difficult down there because I was there last week with the mayor, county commissioner, and others looking at devastation in Loveland. But we also knew it's just as difficult up here in Estes, and they're our neighbors. So we took the roundabout way to get up here to support Estes as well. The floods won't deter them, and neither will the outrageous stupidity of this shutdown. Rocky Mountain National Park is closed, but there's still plenty of other reasons to come and enjoy Estes Park. Earlier today, somebody that works with me named James Thompson spoke with the town's mayor, Bill Pinkham, and asked him what's the one thing he would want me to say on this floor, and the message was plain and simple. He said, "Michael, tell them it's spectacularly beautiful up here. It's still a great experience, and we are open for business. This town has been through a lot and has risen to its challenges. So I say to everybody, come to Estes Park. Enjoy the beauty, shop at our businesses, dine at our restaurants, and meet the folks who wouldn't let a natural disaster or a man-made disaster stop them from succeeding. You can learn more about a trip to Estes Park at visitestespark.com. And to my colleagues, I urge you to come to Colorado for a different reason. Maybe we could all learn something from these incredible people about what it means to pull together in the face of a crisis. And for those of us playing politics with this shutdown and playing politics with this fiscal cliff, I would really encourage you to spend a single moment in one of our flood-ravaged towns. That might bring some welcome clarity to the debate. And with that, Madam President, I yield the floor.
The clerk will call the roll.